Rain pounded Silver Crown Mountain like it was trying to rip the night apart. The ground trembled, deep and low. The kind of sound that doesn't just echo. It crawls into your chest. Windows rattled. Dogs barked. And in the distance, through the sheets of water and the rolling fog, a half-finished mansion stood like a proud fool at the edge of a cliff. Then came the crack. It was sharp, clean, and final. Like a bone snapping, the earth split open, just enough to make the first wall of the mansion tilt. Within seconds, the slope groaned, heavy, ancient, angry. And then it moved. Mud, rock, and broken trees rushed down the mountain like a living thing, swallowing everything in its path. Lights went out. Alarms wailed. People screamed. It wasn't just a storm. It was the mountain taking back what it was owed. And at the center of it all was one woman, Sophia Williams, HOA president, developer, visionary, or at least that's what she called herself. Months earlier, she'd stood at that very spot with a hard hat on, smiling for the cameras as she pushed the detonator. Dynamite boomed, the mountain shook, and she grinned like a queen claiming her throne. Michael Brown, retired engineer, quiet neighbor, had begged her to stop. "The soil won't hold," he'd said. "You'll bring the mountain down." But she laughed. She didn't believe in consequences. She believed in control. She promised luxury resorts, record profits, and a new era for the community. And when anyone questioned her, she waved HOA bylaws in their faces like scripture. Reports were ignored. Safety rules bent. Greed won. Until the rain came. By the time the first retaining wall buckled, it was too late. The mountain didn't care about her titles or her resort or the HOA empire she built. It had been waiting, watching, and when it finally answered, it didn't whisper. It roared. She thought she could own a mountain. That night, the mountain reminded her who's really in charge. Silver Crown Mountain was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to breathe. Tucked away in the Colorado Highlands, it wasn't a luxury destination, at least not at first. It was quiet, steady. A forested stretch of land where streams wove through groves of pine and birch, like veins through skin. Cabins dotted the lower slopes, some decades old, built by families who'd passed them down through generations. Others were newer, glass-paneled homes that caught the morning sun like lanterns. Every morning, mist hung low across the valley, curling over the treetops before melting into the sky. Deer crossed the roads without fear. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs down gravel paths. It was the kind of place where storms whispered through the trees. Not roared. Michael Brown had chosen this place for that quiet. A retired structural engineer with a calm voice and steady hands, he'd moved up the mountain after 30 years in Denver. His cabin wasn't big or modern, but it was solid. Cedar siding, a wide porch, and a view that looked straight into the valley. He'd spent a lifetime reading landscapes, studying rock, soil, and structure. To most people, Silver Crown was beautiful. To Michael, it was beautiful and fragile. He could see the fault lines buried beneath the pines, the soft loam that could shift with enough force. He spent his mornings with coffee on the porch, watching the sun hit the ridgeline, always listening to the subtle language of the mountain, the way water drained, how the soil settled after a storm. He trusted it. He respected it. Which is why, the moment the HOA started talking about development, Michael's stomach sank. The woman behind it all was Sophia Williams, HOA president, 47 years old, tall, always in spotless white sneakers and expensive jackets. Where other people saw a mountain, she saw a resort brochure. Sophia was a visionary in her own mind, someone who believed that rules were made to keep others in line, not herself. She'd arrived 5 years earlier, buying the largest parcel at the mid-slope, turning a modest log cabin into a glass and steel mountain villa. It wasn't enough. She wanted a private resort, spa, and luxury neighborhood on the upper ridge. She called it the Summit Project. The HOA board, hand-picked by her, backed her without hesitation. Over time, new rules started trickling in. At first, it was small things: approved paint colors, strict trash can placement, landscaping fines. Then came more ambitious regulations, limitations on property modifications, community beautification fees, and, most importantly, a new clause granting the HOA development authority over unused mountain land. Michael noticed the shift immediately. He wasn't one for HOA politics, but he knew when something bigger was moving beneath the surface. And in this case, it was literal. One afternoon, an official notice showed up in everyone's mailbox. Silver Crown Development Initiative, Phase 1. Plans for luxury chalets, a clubhouse, private road expansions, and a new drainage system. But the part that made Michael's hands tighten around the paper wasn't the architecture. It was the line that said, slope stabilization and controlled blasting approved per HOA board authority. Blasting Silver Crown Mountain wasn't solid granite. It was a patchwork of shale and soft fill, resting on old erosion lines. It could handle cabins and hiking trails. It couldn't handle being carved open. Michael walked the ridge himself that week. He saw what no one else seemed to notice: small cracks, hairline fractures in the soil, areas where runoff had carved shallow channels, trees listing slightly downhill where the ground had already begun to shift. One deep rainstorm could set it off. One ill-placed explosion could tear it open. At the next HOA meeting, Michael stood up. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "This mountain isn't stable enough for that kind of development," he said. "You're sitting on a slope that's already moving. You can't blast it open and expect it to behave." Sophia didn't even look up from her tablet. She smiled like someone tolerating a child's bedtime story. "We've had it surveyed," she said sweetly. "Our contractors know what they're doing. This will increase property values for everyone." Michael held up his own folder: geological reports, maps, and slope stability diagrams. He had the evidence. But the board didn't care. They weren't interested in the language of rock and soil. They only spoke the language of profit. And then came the first blast. It wasn't massive, not yet, just a test charge to clear space for new retaining walls. But when it went off, the mountain moved. Everyone on the ridge felt it. Glasses rattled in kitchen cabinets. A low, deep groan rolled through the ground like a warning. Michael stepped outside and saw a fine dust rising from the ridge line. A few minutes later, tiny pebbles started trickling down the lower slopes, bouncing across his driveway. He looked at the mountain and whispered, "That's not good." Over the following weeks, development accelerated. Heavy machinery rolled up the mountain, tearing into its skin. Sophia strutted around in hard hats and designer jackets, giving tours to investors and HOA members like a queen surveying her kingdom. Michael started documenting everything: photos, dates, locations of new fissures. He filed official concerns with the HOA. They ignored him. He sent reports to the county. They were reviewing. He tried talking to neighbors. Most were too intimidated or too tired to challenge Sophia. A few early warning signs came and went like whispers. A boulder rolled into the lower access road after a storm. A small landslide near an empty lot forced the temporary closure of a hiking trail. But Sophia brushed it off in every board meeting. "It's just nature," she said with a shrug. "That's why we're building better." Michael had seen enough. He'd spent a lifetime working on projects that respected the land, or paid the price for ignoring it, and this was heading straight for the latter. The official groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for a Friday morning. Sophia arrived in a black SUV, surrounded by smiling board members. They wore shiny helmets and posed for photos with golden shovels. Michael stood at the edge of the crowd, rain jacket zipped tight, watching the detonators being set into the rock. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. The countdown echoed across the valley. 5, 4, 3. The blast ripped through the ridge, shaking the trees, scattering birds into the air. The mountain exhaled a deep, angry groan. People cheered. Investors clapped. But Michael didn't cheer. He knew the mountain had just been wounded. Sophia Williams had no intention of slowing down. Within weeks of the groundbreaking blast, the quiet mountain road that led into Silver Crown turned into a construction artery. Diesel trucks crawled up the slope, their engines growling day and night. Excavators clawed at the hillside, carving out terraces where there used to be birch trees. Rebar cages rose like bones out of the mud. It was chaos wrapped in the language of progress. The HOA board rubber-stamped every step without hesitation. Sophia's name was on every permit application. Her fingerprints were on every fast-tracked approval. Retaining walls, cheaply built, thin and poorly reinforced, lined the slope in uneven layers. It was like watching someone build a sandcastle at the edge of a tide. Michael Brown watched it all from his porch, like a man reading a disaster written in slow motion. Every sound, every rumbling truck, every hammering piledriver was another line in the mountain's obituary. He'd spent his career stabilizing fragile ground. He could tell when a slope was being overworked. And this one wasn't just stressed, it was being brutalized. He started documenting everything. Daily photos, drone footage. He drew diagrams of retaining wall placement and drainage lines. He collected soil samples and sent them to a lab 3 towns over. He gathered the old geological surveys, the ones the HOA conveniently lost during their so-called environmental review, and still, Sophia's empire grew. When Michael brought his concerns to the county engineering office, he was met with polite nods and bureaucratic distance. "We'll review the reports." The HOA has their own contractors. If the HOA board approved it, there's likely a study already on file. There wasn't, but that didn't matter. Silver Crown's HOA was connected. Sophia's brother sat on the county zoning committee. A board member's husband worked for the permit office. They closed ranks like a fortress made of money and favors. And then came the first real sign of the storm to come. A spring rain. Nothing unusual. Just a steady downpour that lasted a night. Turned the lower access road into a mud river. Brown water carried pine needles, pebbles, and silt down the hill. In the morning, Michael found a 6-foot-wide section of the retaining wall near Lot 18 sagging like wet cardboard. Homeowners called the HOA hotline. Sophia responded with a glossy newsletter the next day. "Minor drainage issue. Maintenance crews have been dispatched. Please do not spread panic or misinformation." She made it sound like a pothole, but Michael had stood beside that wall. He'd felt the ground underneath it vibrating, not from the trucks, but from movement inside the slope itself. The kind of deep, slow shifting that precedes something catastrophic. Cracks began appearing at the edges of lower homes, not wide enough to make headlines, but wide enough to be noticed. Foundation hairlines snaked across patios. Concrete steps lifted a 1/4 inch out of alignment. At night, Michael heard it. A groan. That's the only way to describe it. A sound that didn't come from machinery or trees, but from the mountain itself. Sometimes it was low and distant, like distant thunder buried underground. Other times it was closer, a subtle shifting sound, like gravel grinding beneath heavy weight. Sophia dismissed it all. At the next HOA meeting, Michael brought printouts of slope stability simulations and rainwater infiltration models. He spoke calmly, clearly, the way someone does when they've done this their entire life. "You've stripped the slope. There's no real drainage. One strong rain event, and you're going to trigger a landslide." Sophia didn't let him finish. She leaned back in her chair, smiled, and said, "Michael, you're scaring people with your doomsday talk. This mountain is solid rock. It's not going anywhere." Laughter from the board. Some neighbors stared at the floor. A few avoided his eyes entirely. The HOA followed up the next morning with a letter tucked under every door. "Residents are reminded that unauthorized dissemination of false geological information can result in fines. All official communications regarding development are to come from the HOA board." It was a warning, thinly veiled as policy. Still, Michael refused to back down. He went over the HOA's head again. this time to the State Geological Agency. He sent them everything: photos, reports, rainfall data. And then he waited. While he waited, the rain returned. The rainy season had arrived early that year. Each storm pulled at the slope like fingers loosening a knot. The drainage systems Sophia's contractors had thrown together were laughably inadequate. Water pooled behind retaining walls, leaking through in muddy streams. Workers dumped gravel to hide the problem instead of fixing it. Neighbors began to whisper, not at meetings, but at night, over fences, in hushed voices. "Did you see the crack by the North Road? My porch is tilting." "I heard something last night," Sophia responded with another newsletter. Bold letters across the top. "Don't feed the panic." She doubled down on construction. While water seeped through the mountain's wounds, her personal mansion on the upper ridge grew taller. Marble columns, a glass facade, infinity pool foundations laid into the soft soil. She called it the crown jewel. Michael called it a ticking bomb. He brought in a friend, an old colleague from his engineering days, to look at the site unofficially. The man walked the ridge with him in silence, boots squelching in the wet ground. When they reached the top, the engineer crouched and touched the soil where Sophia's foundation was being laid. "This isn't rock," he muttered. "It's loose fill. If this goes, it's taking everything below it with it." Michael didn't need the confirmation, but it felt like hearing a second clock ticking. 2 weeks later, the inevitable began showing itself. After a week of rain, the crack appeared. It started as a narrow fissure, half an inch wide, snaking across the ground behind Sophia's mansion like a vein. But it didn't stay small. Each storm widened it. 2 inches, then 3. You could fit your fingers inside it. And it wasn't alone. Smaller cracks branched downward like tributaries of a river no one wanted to see flood. Michael documented it all. Photos, measurements, a timeline. He sent everything again to the state. No response yet. Sophia, meanwhile, hosted a champagne progress tour for investors, walking them past the fissure like it was just part of the landscaping. Michael stood on his porch that evening, rain dripping from the eaves, watching the lights from the half-built mansion shimmer through the mist. The fissure behind it was growing. The slope was alive, and soon it was going to break. He had spent months trying to warn them, trying to stop what was coming. Now, as thunder rumbled over the ridge and rain began to pound the valley once more, Michael realized something chilling. It wasn't about if anymore. It was about when. And that moment was getting closer with every drop of rain. The rain came like it had been waiting for this night. Sheets of water pounded Silver Crown Mountain, hammering rooftops, flooding gutters, and turning pathways into rivers of mud. The entire ridge was shrouded in fog, but Michael didn't need to see to know what was happening. He could hear it. The mountain was groaning. Not the soft rumble he'd grown used to over the last few weeks. This was deeper. A low, guttural sound that rolled through the valley like the growl of something ancient and alive. It vibrated through the wooden porch beneath his boots. It whispered through the wind. It was the sound of something that had reached its limit. At 9:13 p.m., the power went out. Street lights blinked. Then darkness swallowed the community. The only light came from a handful of flashlights and the dull, rhythmic pulses of construction spotlights near Sophia's half-finished mansion at the top of the ridge. Michael stepped outside into the storm. Rain soaked his jacket in seconds. Down the slope, he could already see rivulets of mud carving through the hillside like veins. They were no longer trickles. They were small rivers. Retaining walls bowed outward. Some were already buckling. He yelled toward his neighbor's house. "Get out! Now!" His voice barely carried over the wind. The fissure behind Sophia's mansion, the one he'd measured inch by inch, was now a jagged black wound in the earth. He watched in real time as it widened, 2 feet, 3, 4, chunks of soil and stone falling into the dark void beneath. And then came the sound. A crack. Not like a tree breaking or a beam snapping. It was sharper, heavier, like the mountain itself had exhaled a final breath. The slope gave way. In seconds, the ground behind Sophia's crown jewel fractured, and the entire hillside lunged downward. A wall of mud, boulders, uprooted pines, and construction debris surged forward with terrifying speed. Sophia's mansion didn't just collapse, it was swallowed. The infinity pool, the marble columns, the steel beams, everything folded like paper as the earth consumed it. Floodlights exploded into sparks. A generator was dragged under like a toy. Workers on site screamed. Some bolted toward the service road, slipping in the mud. One construction truck tipped sideways and vanished into the torrent. The roar was indescribable, a mix of thunder, breaking trees, grinding stone, and the mountain's fury. Windows shattered in lower homes as the slide gained momentum, tearing through everything in its path. Michael ran, not away, downhill, toward his neighbors. His boots slid on the wet gravel, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the storm. "Get to the higher road," he shouted, banging on doors. "This is it, move!" Cars were already being shoved sideways by the flow of mud. A swing set from someone's yard bobbed in the flood like a matchstick. Docks at the lake edge splintered as waves of debris slammed into them. Sophia herself stumbled out of the darkness, barefoot, drenched, screaming at no one and everyone. Her pristine hair was plastered to her face, mascara streaking like black rivers. She spun toward where her mansion used to be. There was nothing left, only black, churning earth where her empire had stood. "This can't be happening," she screamed. But the mountain didn't care. Michael grabbed an elderly couple off their porch just as a section of their retaining wall collapsed into the mud. He pulled them uphill, rain blinding his eyes, the ground vibrating beneath them like a living thing. Neighbors followed. Some screamed, some were silent. All were drenched and terrified. A tree cracked behind them and fell into the flow, vanishing into the brown surge. By 9:36 p.m., the slide had ripped through nearly half the ridge. Roads were buried, cars gone, power poles snapped. Sophia's unfinished mansion, once the HOA's symbol of wealth and control, was nothing but twisted steel buried beneath tons of earth. Michael stopped at the crest of the evacuation road, chest heaving, soaked to the bone. He turned back toward the slope just in time to see the last construction light flicker out, swallowed whole. The storm howled, the mountain roared, and for a long, shuddering moment, the world went still except for the rain. Sophia fell to her knees in the mud. Her empire had collapsed in less than 10 minutes. She thought she was above nature, Michael whispered. But nature doesn't take orders. The rain stopped hours after the landslide, but the sound of that night never really left Silver Crown Mountain. By morning, the scale of what had happened came into focus. Half the ridge was gone, homes buried, power lines snapped, roads obliterated. A thick fog clung to the valley, like the mountain itself was ashamed of what had been done to it. Helicopters circled overhead. News crews lined the entrance road. Police, county engineers, and environmental response teams arrived in waves. Sophia Williams didn't arrive in a designer suit this time. She arrived in handcuffs. Within days, investigators uncovered everything Michael had warned them about, and more. Unapproved blasting permits, falsified engineering reports, payments from construction companies tied directly to HOA accounts. A mountain that was never meant to be carved open had been weakened by greed, and everyone knew who had led the charge. The lawsuits came fast. Civil, criminal, environmental. HOA board members scrambled to lawyer up. Their development fund was exposed for what it really was, a slush pile built on bribes and fake permits. Sophia faced multiple charges, including criminal negligence and environmental violations. Her half-finished mansion, once a monument to control, was now a crater filled with wet soil and twisted beams. For the first time in years, the HOA didn't call the shots, And strangely, that's when the community started to heal. Without the constant threat of fines, surveillance, and aesthetic enforcement, people began to talk to each other again. Volunteers coordinated cleanup efforts. Families who had lost everything found support from neighbors they'd barely spoken to before. Potluck tables replaced board meetings. Sandbag walls replaced endless violation letters. Michael Brown became a quiet hero, not because he had saved the mountain, but because he had tried. Long before the disaster, he had sounded the alarm. He'd filed the reports, drawn the maps, begged them to listen. They hadn't. But now, standing in front of what was left of Silver Crown Mountain, people finally understood. Months passed. The HOA dissolved under the weight of lawsuits and unpaid claims. County officials announced a full restoration program with state environmental agencies. Heavy machinery came, not to build, but to heal. Saplings were planted where foundations once stood. New runoff channels were dug to stabilize what remained of the slope. Nature had ripped the illusion of control away, and now it was time to respect it. Some homes would never be rebuilt. Entire families relocated. The lower ridge was declared uninhabitable. But those who stayed learned something they could never unlearn. They'd place their trust in people who believed rules and power could overpower the earth itself. Michael stood at the base of the mountain one crisp autumn morning. Months after the slide, the air was cold and clear. The scars in the slope were still visible, but green shoots had already begun to appear along the edges. The mountain was healing itself in the way only nature can, slowly, quietly, steadily. In the distance, the crater where Sophia's mansion once stood looked smaller now, almost insignificant compared to the vastness of the ridge. The silence wasn't threatening anymore. It was final. Sophia's name had become a cautionary tale, not a legend, not a legacy, just a warning whispered in news reports and HOA reform meetings across the state. The people of Silver Crown no longer had an HOA. They had a community, one that learned the hard way what happens when greed tries to claim what belongs to the earth. Michael picked up a loose stone at his feet. Smooth, cold, probably ripped from somewhere deep inside the mountain during the slide. He turned it over in his palm, thinking of the reports he filed, the meetings he sat through, the looks of dismissal from the people who thought they were invincible. "You can build walls against people," he whispered to the wind, "but never against nature." He let the stone fall back to the ground. Would you have fought back? Or watched it happen?